Now, on the national scene, the suffrage movement had actually split in about 1870, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had formed what they called the National Women's Suffrage Association, and Lucy Stone had formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. And Stanton and Anthony were always more interested in a federal amendment to institute suffrage. Lucy Stone would put more emphasis on a state-by-state approach. In 1890, as the women were aging, they kind of buried the hatchet and they merged their two organizations into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And initially, when it was formed in 1890, Stanton was the president, Anthony was the vice president, and Lucy Stone was the head of the board. But Lucy was right at the end of her life and faded out of the scene in a couple of years. Stanton retired in 1892, and at that point Anthony became the president of the NAWSA and served until 1900 as president. And then she was succeeded by Carrie Chapman Catt, who we talked about earlier, who served as president until 1904, and then she left and was replaced by Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, who led the NAWSA until 1915. When Catt came back to the leadership. Now, this is a period, we're kind of back to the prohibition question. So keep in mind, Iowa is officially a dry state, but here's a picture from 1891, and we have the Northern Exchange Saloon operating in Sioux City at 211 Douglas Street, and the guys out front here don't look too worried about being arrested for running an illegal saloon. So clearly, there wasn't much enforcement of the state law in Sioux City in the early 1890s. And here we have a picture of an unidentified group, but I suspect it's a German-American club, and they're enjoying drinking beer out at Riverside Park. And so this is an example of the people that were certainly the most against prohibition, but the same it tended to be throughout the country, not just in Iowa. It tended to be that immigrant voters tended to be anti-suffrage, and some of it had to be with that they were anti-prohibition, and they feared that women's suffrage would lead to prohibition. The other thing is a lot of immigrants came from Germany, the Scandinavian countries, Ireland, places where there really was no tradition of voting or democratic participation at all. And so they just weren't interested in that side of things and stuck to the traditional male-dominated family and society. And so it tended to be when votes would come up on both of these issues, the kind of immigrant-heavy cities and counties would vote against both prohibition and suffrage. And Sioux City, as a big, growing industrial city, had its fair share of immigrant residents, and therefore was one of the cities that tended to resist both suffrage and prohibition. Now, in 1894, Iowa did, for the first time, enfranchised women in a limited way. The state legislature passed a bill that allowed women to vote in municipal and school elections. So from 1894 on, women in Iowa, kind of like that Kentucky law in 1839, only all women in Iowa, all adult women in Iowa, in this case they didn't have to be heads of households, could vote basically in local elections after 1894. At the same time, in that very same legislature, the legislature passed what they called a mulct law. And a mulct is a legal term for a fine. And essentially what the mulct law did was allow saloons, liquor distributors, and breweries to operate in violation of Iowa's 1884 prohibition law. And so that law was in effect, but it was a form of legal or of local option without actually saying it was local option. But that's how the mulct law worked, is that the local liquor businesses would pay a fine, which was pretty much like a tax, in order to operate. And that's how that worked then until the end of 1915. Here we have our local representatives in 1894. We have James D. Yeomans, who was a Democrat from Sioux City, serving in the Iowa Senate. But he didn't vote in 1894 because he had been appointed to the Interstate Commerce Commission by President Grover Cleveland, and so he wasn't there for the vote in that case. I don't think he was shirking his vote in this case. I think he was physically not there to vote. In the House at this point, our part of the state had grown enough that there were 2 House representatives. William B. Chapman was a Republican from Correctionville in the House, and he voted yes for the 1894 law twice, because the House voted on it 2 times. And then Prince A. Sawyer was a Republican House member from Sioux City, and on the first vote he voted yes, and then on the second vote he voted no. So he was obviously a little bit split in his opinion on women's suffrage. And very soon after that Mulct Law was passed, 1894, the brewing industry came back to Sioux City, and so here we have a picture on the left of the Sioux City Brewing Company being built at 3rd and Park Street, and it opened in 1899. And then later in 1908, we have a picture of the Interstate Brewing Company being built out at West 1st and Isabella Streets. And so prior to the return of the repeal of the Mulct Law in the end of 1915, Sioux City had 2 big breweries locally. So you can see that Sioux City probably wasn't going to be very supportive of any type of prohibition law in the state of Iowa. Now, the Sioux City Political Equality Club, this developed out of that, this is still the same club that Carrie Chapman Catt helped organize in 1889. Here we have, I wish I had a better picture, this is taken from a newspaper, but it's club members putting on a play called Put to the Test. And these are all women, but they're dressed up as men and women, and it's kind of a spoof of the whole idea of involving suffrage and men's and women's roles, and they performed it in the basement of the First Unitarian Church. And so you can see the Unitarian Church did play a role in the early suffrage movement in Sioux City. And then on the right we have a picture of Evelyn Belden, who was the first Sioux City woman elected to be president of the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association. She served from 1898 to 1901, and during her presidency she helped get the Iowa General Assembly to return to the suffrage amendment, but unfortunately a measure was defeated in the House in 1899 and then in both houses in 1900. And so ironically it was tougher in 1900 to get suffrage legislation going in the Iowa legislature than it had been back in the 1870s and early 1880s. Now, at this point, we want to talk want to expand to some other areas. So in Britain, in 1903, a woman named Emmeline Pankhurst had founded the Women's Social and Political Union, which also involved her daughters, particularly her daughter Christabel Pankhurst. And they became what were known as the Militant Suffragists, and they were who the British press dubbed the Suffragettes, and that was supposed to be a derisive term, but they eventually embraced it. And they advocated militant tactics like parades, which were considered militant in the early 1900s, demonstrations, but they eventually moved to attacking police, like throwing rocks at them, and damaging property, breaking windows. Eventually they burned abandoned buildings down. And when they were arrested, they would stage hunger strikes to protest how they were being treated. And then the authorities would oftentimes resort to force feeding them so that they wouldn't starve to death. And of course, that was a brutal process. And it was all in a way to provoke. They wanted to get people's sympathy for suffrage by showing how badly women could be treated when they were just asking for what they considered their inherent rights. And those militant tactics became increasingly important in the United States and even in Iowa. Although Iowa didn't have a lot of examples of the most militant things like parades, Iowa was actually a leader in, as we'll see. We also have a picture of Mary J. Coggeshall, who was one of in some ways, the mother of women's suffrage in Iowa. She was a founding member of the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association in 1870. She served as president of the Equal Suffrage Association a couple of different times. But in 1908, she was involved in a lawsuit because she lived in Des Moines, and the city of Des Moines refused to give ballots to women to vote in on a local bond issue. And her case made it all the way to the Iowa Supreme Court, and the court ruled in her favor and voided that election because women had not been allowed to vote. And so this put that 1894 law to test, and the Supreme Court upheld it. And so women were ensured of their right to vote in the local elections. In 1908, Iowa was the scene of the third suffrage parade in the United States. So even though the suffrage movement had really started in the United States, the British had led in the more militant tactics. And while I don't think we would consider parades to be militant today, that was considered militant in the early 1900s. And so the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association, which at this point was being led by Eleanor Gordon, the former first Unitarian minister from Sioux City, they staged a parade at Boone, Iowa. And they paraded to downtown Boone, Iowa. There were about 150 marchers. And then once they got to downtown, they listened to a speech by Anna Howard Shaw, who was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And so it was quite a big event. It was the biggest state women's suffrage event up to that point, and it was one of the big events in the United States at that time. And here we have in the bottom left-hand corner, we also have a picture of Julia Clark Hallam, who was the third Sioux City woman to be elected president of the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association. She served in 1909 and 1910. And Hallam was actually quite an advocate of the more militant tactics. She was involved in organizing the Boone Parade, and she wanted to continue with that and also include things like protests at the Iowa legislature. But those types of tactics met pretty strong resistance amongst the other Iowa suffragists. And she was not retained. She was eventually replaced as president by Mary Stafford, who we'll talk about later. But Hallam remained an important Sioux City suffragist through the whole process. And now we get to the national stage, and we have the leaders of kind of the militant wing of the American suffrage movement, and those are Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Now Alice Paul, she was going to, while she was attending the London School of Economics in 1908, she joined Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union, and while she was participating in some of their activities, she was jailed and she endured a forced feeding. But through this all, she was completely converted to their types of tactics. And so she returned to the United States in 1910, and she joined the NAWSA, and she was sent by that organization to Congress in early 1913 to promote the passage of a suffrage amendment, which hadn't gone anywhere in years in Washington. And while she was there, she was working with her assistant, Lucy Burns, and they organized the first big suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. And so here we have a couple of pictures of the Washington, D.C. march in 1913. So you can see it was on the 3rd of March, 1913. That was the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson as president, and they did that on purpose to put pressure on the Wilson organization or administration. And there were lots of, especially guys in town for the inauguration, a lot of them drunk, and there was quite a bit of public indignation, or there was quite a bit of anger over the idea of the suffrage march amongst some of the onlookers, and it caused a near riot. Actually, it had the effect of reviving the suffrage movement nationally, because the public didn't like how the suffragists, who were in a peaceful march at this point, were treated during their parade. We also have a picture of Inez Milholland, who rode a white horse and made kind of a stunning sight in leading the parade. Now we return back to Iowa. Mary Stafford, the original minister at First Unitarian Church, she was no longer in Sioux City. She was serving in Des Moines at the time. But she became president of the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association in 1911, and it was during her presidency that first off, that suffrage got the endorsement of the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs, which was 3 years before the National Federation endorsed suffrage. So in that way, Iowa led again in getting that type of endorsement, and then. She also really laid the groundwork for what became the 1916 suffrage amendment in Iowa. She pushed the state legislature to take up women's suffrage again and to try to pass suffrage resolutions, which they did between 1911 and 1913. It failed in 1911, but succeeded in 1913 and 1915, which led to the statewide referendum in 1916. So in 1911, the state legislature took up a suffrage amendment resolution again, and this time it failed in both houses, failed in both the House and the Senate. And our local representatives at the time were Robert Hunter in the Senate, who was a Republican from Sioux City. He voted yes for the amendment. And then in the House were two Republicans, Ulysses G. Whitney and William L. Harding, who will come up later in the story as well, and they both voted no for it. So so there was kind of mixed support amongst the Iowa delegation. But then it came right back in 1913 and 1915, and actually passed fairly easily in both houses in both sessions by significant majorities, and. Let's see how, and also then an act to submit the amendment to a public referendum was passed, and at that time the senator was Edgar P. Farr, who was a Democrat from Sioux City, and he voted yes for the resolution both in 1913 and 1915, and then he voted against the referendum, which I find an odd contradiction, but I suppose maybe that was his way of getting out of his 2 yes votes, I suppose. Ulysses G. Whitney changed his vote from 1911 and voted yes in 1913. And then in 1913 and 1915, Thomas Griffin, who was a Republican House member from Sioux City, he didn't vote in either time, and I suspect he just didn't want to go down as voting no, and then for the referendum he voted no. So he, at that point, seemed to be fairly against the suffrage movement. And then James S. Michael, who was a Democrat from Sioux City in the House in 1915, he didn't vote also, and then voted no against the referendum. So I think you could say that the two House members in 1915 weren't for suffrage at that point, but it passed nevertheless. Now, William Lloyd Harding actually was serving as lieutenant governor at this point, so he was president of the Senate in 1913 and 1915. And Harding is an interesting character in a number of ways. First of all, he's the only Sioux City resident to ever serve as lieutenant governor or governor of Iowa. He was a three-term member of the House, of the Iowa House before that, a graduate of Morningside College. But in 1916, on the eve of the year of the suffrage referendum in Iowa, he was running for Iowa governor, and he had an interesting. He was always kind of lukewarm towards suffrage, but he wasn't against it really. He took the view that he personally wasn't enthusiastic about it, but if the Republican Party, which he was a member of, was for it, he wasn't going to undermine that with his own personal views. His other thing was he refused to take a stand on prohibition. And so therefore was accused of being a wet, which the anti-prohibitionists were called by the Dries. And then his other main issue during the 1916 campaign for governor was he advocated local control for road improvements in rural communities. And so those were kind of the three big issues that year. And he sort of was non-committal on both suffrage and prohibition, and then was for local option and road improvement. And that ended up being a winning formula for him. Now, in the run-up to the resolution, Sioux City, again, had been in another period of rapid growth ever since 1900. And so here we have a picture on Pierce Street looking north from about 3rd Street. And so you can kind of see the center of downtown Sioux City. In 1913, I can make out just down the line right above the Willigus Fur Company sign on the right. You can see Charles Seltzer, who was a wholesale liquor dealer at the time. So the liquor business was still alive and well in Sioux City at this point. Here we have a picture of the north side of 4th Street between Douglas and Pierce Streets. And you can see the people are standing outside the Olympic Theater waiting to get into a movie. But right next to it is a bar. And so that was another example of how Sioux City was a wet city in 1915. Here we have the interior of the new Exchange Saloon, which was inside the Livestock Exchange building down in the Stockyards District in 1915. And so you can see an indication that Sioux City wasn't a prohibitionist stronghold. Now, since the Iowa legislature had passed suffrage amendments in 1913 and 1915, it was then referred to a vote of Iowa's all-male voters in 1916. And so during the early 1916, before the vote in June, there was a big campaign all across the state of Iowa in which nationally prominent suffragists came to Sioux City to plead the case to vote for suffrage. And Sioux City was a real battleground in this movement as the second largest city in the state. Sioux City had about 60,000 people by this point, and was a very important place in Iowa. So the leader of the suffrage campaign in Sioux City was Anna Stason, who was the chair of the Woodbury County Campaign Committee, and Cora H. Bilchrist, who was the president of the Council of Women. And one of the people that stands out as a major local supporter of the referendum was Reverend William L. Patterson of Wesley Methodist Church in Leeds, in which he made a impassioned speech that women had been denied their inalienable American rights by not being enfranchised up to this point. Now, the suffrage headquarters were located at 612 4th Street in what was called Frank's European Hotel. And we have a picture of Leonard H. Frank, who owned the hotel. And this was on the south side of 4th Street between Nebraska and Jackson Streets. So right south of the museum building today. And so I have a little red arrow here that points to the space, and that had actually been George A. Ford's saloon until January of 1916, when the Iowa State Legislature reimposed prohibition in the state of Iowa, and the saloon had to close, and so the women suffragists used that as their campaign headquarters in early 1916. They had hosted a bunch of different events at the Martin Hotel. They hosted a suffrage ball to entertain the suffragists that were in town. And so the Martin Hotel was a new structure. It opened in 1912 at the northeast corner of 4th and Pierce Streets. So here we have a picture of it in its early days. At the Princess Theater, there was a performance, a pro-suffrage performance by Morgan Wallace, who became a pretty prominent character actor during the 1930s and 1940s, in both on Broadway and in Hollywood. Morgan Wallace, and he had a troupe called the Morgan Wallace Players that played in Sioux City often during the 19-teens, and they staged a pro-suffrage performance at the Princess Theater. Suffragists went down to Mizzou Park, which was at the southwest corner of 2nd and Pierce Street. And this is where Iowa's local minor league baseball team, which had been the Sioux City Packers and was now at this point called the Sioux City Indians, played. And so this was in the spring of 1916 when baseball was just starting, and the suffragists handed out pro-suffrage leaflets to the baseball fans at Mizzou Park during the 1916 campaign. And then there were speakers both for suffragists and for the anti-suffragists, as they were called, that came into Sioux City to plead their case. One of them was Owen R. Lovejoy, who was the General Secretary of the National Child Labor Committee. Another was Henry J. Allen, who was a newspaper editor from Kansas, who went on to become governor of Kansas in the early 1920s, and then later a U.S. Senator from Kansas. Deborah Livingston, who was the superintendent for suffrage for the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, she came to speak. And then there were also anti-suffragists. And so here in Sioux City, the anti-suffragists were led by Mary Gay Dolliver, who was Morningside College's Dean of Women between 1906 and 1916. Also the sister of the late U.S. Iowa Senator Jonathan P. Dolliver. And another, there were women in Sioux City that weren't for suffrage. Vancy Palmer, who was a founding member of the Sioux City Women's Club, she left the club because it endorsed suffrage in 1916, and she found it impossible to be in the club now that it had become what she called it, now that it had become a suffrage club, and so she left in protest. And there were anti-suffrage speakers brought in from the outside, and here's where John P. Irish comes up. Irish had actually moved to California in 1880 and became a pretty large landowner near Stockton. But from that point on, he was a sought-after political speaker on a number of occasions. I saw a quote where someone said he was an effective public speaker of the denunciatory type, and so anyway, he was somewhat of a character, sounds like, but he was an advocate of treating the Chinese and Japanese immigrants into California better than they were at that time. He protested things like the Chinese Exclusion Act back in the 1880s and such. But he at some point turned against women's suffrage, and he also was against labor unions. And so he was one of the people that spoke against suffrage. Another person was Claire Oliphant, who was a member of the National Association opposed to the further extension of suffrage, and she was from Trenton, New Jersey, and the wife of a civil official in Trenton. And there were other organizations like this led by socially prominent women. She went on to become president of the American Legion Auxiliary during the 1920s, and so she was another speaker against suffrage. And even within the suffrage movement itself, there was a division. There were suffragists who didn't want to be tied so tightly to prohibition. And keep in mind, right before this, the state of Iowa had repealed the Molt Law of 1894. And so basically, statewide prohibition had gone back into effect at the beginning of 1916. And so in Sioux City, all the two breweries had to close, all the bars and saloons officially closed, the liquor dealers, and so they were all out of business, and so there was quite a bit of resentment from certain quarters as a result of that. And so Charles L. Lockey, who was the head of the Sioux City Men's Suffrage Association, which was a pro-suffrage local group, he told Claude McMillan, who was the superintendent of the Woodbury County Anti-Saloon League, that his organization didn't want to share expenses for William Jennings Bryan's speech in Sioux City if Bryan didn't agree to avoid the liquor question. And McMillan pretty quickly retorted that Bryan would speak on women's suffrage and constitutional prohibition. And so because of that, the Lockey's group both refused to share in the expenses of Bryan's appearance, but then also refused to sit on the stage at the Sioux City Auditorium where he spoke, because they didn't want to be seen as advocates of prohibition, even though they were advocates of women's suffrage. And here we have a picture of the Sioux City Municipal Auditorium as it was in 1916, located at the southwest corner of 7th and Douglas Streets. And this is where William Jennings Bryan gave the keynote address in favor of suffrage. Now, Bryan was a former Nebraska U.S. congressman in the 1890s. He was a giant of the Democratic Party. He was a 3-time Democratic Party presidential nominee, 1896, 1900, 1908. He had very recently served as U.S. Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, but had recently, at the end of 1915, broke with Wilson because he felt like Wilson was inching the country closer to entering World War I, and Bryan was a lifelong pacifist. And so Bryan was the one that gave the keynote address, and indeed, in his address, he was a renowned orator, and he very directly tied women's suffrage to the prohibition question, and said that not only did women deserve a say in whether their husbands and sons became drunkards, but that they also, if women were enfranchised, it would guarantee that any prohibition law that was passed at either the state or federal levels was more likely to stick permanently than if women weren't enfranchised. And so that kind of set up the vote. And so the vote was held on the 5th of June, 1916, and statewide it failed by 10,000 votes out of 336 cast. So that means the anti-suffragists got a 52% majority. So, a pretty close election by any count. Now, suffragists claimed that there was widespread fraud, and there may well have been. Although where the measure failed the worst was where it was traditionally the least popular, and that was mostly, you can see by the chart we have here, all the yellow dots are where the suffrage amendment passed in the county, and all the white dots are where it failed, and then inside it has by how much it either passed by in favor or failed. And if you look closely at the ones along the Mississippi River in places like Dubuque County, Clinton County, Scott County where Davenport is, Lynn County where Cedar Rapids is, these were all strongly anti-prohibitionist, anti-suffrage places, and mostly linked to the prohibition question. You can see, for instance, in Dubuque County, it failed by 4,400 votes. In Scott County, it failed by 2,700 votes. It failed by significant margins. Now, in Woodbury County, it was very close. The measure failed by 127 votes in Woodbury County out of over 9,000 cast. It failed by slightly more in Sioux City. It failed by 195 votes, but by no means did it fail miserably in Sioux City. That was out of over 6,300 cast. And it was actually affirmed by 68 votes outside of Sioux City in the rural parts of Woodbury County, out of over almost 2,900 votes cast in rural Woodbury County. So you can see it was quite close in Woodbury County. I find it interesting that if you look to the north in Plymouth County and Sioux County, which certainly weren't hotbeds of opposition to prohibition at this point, the measure actually failed worse there by over 500 votes in Plymouth County and by over 600 votes in Sioux County. So obviously there was something else at work there, but it's pretty clear that along especially northwest Iowa, the referendum failed, and in far eastern Iowa it failed, and then it was strongest in southern Iowa and in central Iowa, and then there were pockets of support in the north. Now we get back to William Lloyd Harding. So Harding kind of, as this was going on, actually the same month, in June of 1916, he won the Republican nomination for governor, and then ran against Edwin T. Meredith in the fall, and he defeated Meredith in a landslide. He won 98 of 99 counties, which was with a 61% majority, those three, his method of running kind of non-committal on suffrage and prohibition, combined with local control of road improvement, proved to be a winning formula in 1916. He ran for re-election in 1918 and again won. He beat Claude Porter, but in a much closer race. He only won 51% majority in 1918. And that was after the U.S. had entered World War I. And in May of 1918 had issued his famous language proclamation, which outlawed the speaking of foreign languages in Iowa in any publics in public, whether it was in a public speech, over the phone, in church, in school, and that alienated a large portion of Iowa's immigrant community, and probably explains why his victory was much less in the fall of 1918. I doubt it was linked very closely to his positions on suffrage and prohibition, but it's possible there was some connection. Actually, Harding, as governor, was fairly supportive of prohibition. The Republicans pretty firmly swung in support of women's suffrage in 1913, and he pretty steadily supported it as governor, even if he personally wasn't all that enthusiastic about it. Even though the state referendum in 1916 had failed, prohibition, or actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Prohibition came back to the state legislature in 1917. So at this point, Iowa was officially dry according to the Iowa state law. The 1917 legislature tried to reinstate or passed a prohibition amendment, and then it. After it had already, so this was the second time because it had been passed in 1915 as well, and so it went to a vote of a statewide vote of Iowa's voters in the fall of 1917, and the Prohibition Amendment resolution failed by only 932 votes out of 430,000. So Iowa never at any point had a prohibition amendment to its constitution. The two times it tried to do it, it failed. So in 1917, that same 1917 assembly, though, returned to women's suffrage, and both houses easily passed a women's suffrage resolution. Unfortunately, the Iowa Constitution required the Iowa Secretary of State to report that the passage of the law in certain newspapers around the state before the next General Assembly sat, and the Secretary of State, William S. Allen, his office failed to do that, and so the 1919 legislature was barred from taking up the 1917 resolution. That was on a technical error. But let's see where our local representatives voted in 1917. So Charles Lytle was was a Republican senator from Sioux City, and he voted yes for suffrage in 1917. Thomas Griffin was still in the Iowa House, and he voted no again on suffrage. And then Frank Lake was a Republican House member from Sioux City, and he also voted no. So we had one senator vote yes and two House members vote no. Now, at the national level, things were kind of coming to a head. For one thing, Alice Paul and her allies were kicked out of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1914 because they were just seen as too radical, especially their confrontations with President Wilson alienated a lot of the membership of the NAWSA. And so they started their own organization. They merged their congressional union, which had been part of the NAWSA, with the equally militant Women's Political Union, which had been founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter Harriet in 1907, and their new organization became the National Women's Party in 1917, which still exists. But the National Women's Party continued to use the more militant tactics, and so they really had a confrontation with Woodrow Wilson. They saw him as stonewalling the whole issue during this period. And so here we have a picture of National Women's Party members picketing outside the White House, which they did pretty much continuously all through Woodrow Wilson's presidency until the passage of the 19th Amendment. and here's the types of things they would do. So they became increasingly confrontational. And so here we have one member on the left holding a Kaiser Wilson sign and basically comparing Woodrow Wilson to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, the king of Germany at this time during World War I. And they continued to picket the White House during Wilson's second inauguration in March of 1917, and then even after the U.S. entered World War I in April of 1917. And because they continued to do that, the crowds that were in town for the Wilson inauguration again reacted angrily, and this time Alice Paul and 200 of her protesters were jailed for some time during 1917. So here we have a picture of Lucy Burns in jail, and they staged a hunger strike following the lead of the British suffragettes. And here we have a picture of what the process of force feeding was like in jail, and it was a brutal thing. And that that type of thing always kind of roused the sympathy of the American public when they saw women treated that way. But the U.S. Entering World War I in April of 1917 really changed everything for women. And I think it's hard to argue that more than anything kind of tipped the scales in favor of the passage of women's suffrage nationally and in the United States. It was kind of on a course toward passing anyway, but the role that women played in World War I just changed the public mood when it came to the suffrage question. And so during World War I, more than 22,000 women served in the U.S. Army and Nurse Corps. 11,000 more served in the U.S. Navy. And then 8 million women volunteered for service in the American Red Cross, both here in the United States and overseas. And so we have a poster showing an American woman serving as a Red Cross nurse. We have pictures of female members of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. They were called the Hello Girls. And then the U.S. Navy had a little quirk in its enlistment rules that didn't bar women from joining. And so we have a group of U.S. Navy yeomanettes pictured here. So lots of women served directly in military service. And then women also basically replaced the men that were in the military in the economy here back in the United States. And so almost 5 million American men were in military service during World War I. And the jobs they left had to be taken over by somebody, and women filled a lot of them. So we have pictures of women working in various industries, which you probably would have never seen. Well, you definitely never would have seen a woman working a lathe, for instance, like you see here on the right prior to World War I. We also had the Women's Land Army, where women would take the role of farmers who had been called away to service, and so that's a great poster. But it didn't take long for the women's support of the war effort to change American public opinion. In November of 1917, New York State, the most populous state, easily approved a women's suffrage referendum and enfranchised the state's women, and that seemed to change everything for Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, I think, was personally an advocate of women's suffrage, but he was a Democrat, and the Democrats were much more against women's suffrage than the Republicans at this point. And he was waiting for a point when he could kind of force his party along, and it seems like the passage of the New York Resolution changed everything for him, and he really started advocating women's suffrage at that point. And so right away, first off, in the 19-teens, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was dealt with in Congress a couple of times. It failed in the Senate in 1914, and then it failed in the House in 1915. And you might say, well, it got majorities. Well, remember, to amend the U.S. Constitution, a constitutional amendment resolution has to pass each House by a 2/3 majority, so roughly 67% majority. And so a simple majority doesn't cut it at the federal level. You have to get to that 67% level, and they weren't able to get there in 1914 and 1915. In 1918, after Woodrow Wilson started really pushing for the passage of the suffrage amendment in Congress. The House in early 1918 passed it. It just barely by 1 or 2 votes made it to the 67% level. But the Senate failed by 2 or 3 votes. It only made it to 63%. And so then the Senate tried it again in February of 1919, and again it made it all the way to 65%. I think it was 2 votes short of making it. And so the 65th Congress, which sat until March of 1919, was not able to pass the suffrage amendment. And so as a result, Wilson called a special session of the 66th Congress, which took office in March of 1919, and they met in May of 1919, and just with the specific goal of trying to pass the suffrage amendment, and it passed the House easily on the May 21st, and then it passed the Senate with some room to spare on June 4th. And here we have a picture of the Vice President Thomas Marshall acting as the president of the Senate, signing the 19th Amendment after the Senate had approved it on the 4th of June. So then it went to the states, and at that point you had to get 3/4 of the states, so 75%, to vote to approve it at the state legislature level. And in 1919 there were 48 states, and so you had to get to 36 states, and that took a little over a year to accomplish. Iowa was the 10th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And actually, the 1919 General Assembly here in Iowa was quite active on the suffrage front. First off, it started over on the process of trying to pass a state suffrage amendment, and you can see it easily passed both houses of the state legislature in 1919. The state legislature also passed a presidential suffrage bill. So this was a bill that would have allowed women to vote in the next presidential election in 1920, even if the 19th Amendment had failed. And that passed easily in both houses. And then by sweeping majorities, both houses approved the 19th Amendment on the 2nd of July 1919, which was a special session that Governor Harding called into session to deal specifically with the 19th Amendment. And so let's go through where our local representatives stood on these issues. Our Senate representative was Bertil M. Stoddard of Sloan, Iowa, and he voted yes on all 3 for the suffrage amendment to the state constitution, for presidential suffrage, and for the 19th Amendment. Frank Lake, who was still in the Iowa House, he didn't vote for the Iowa suffrage amendment, but he voted yes for presidential suffrage and the 19th Amendment. And then Thomas Griffin, who was still in the House as well from Sioux City, voted yes for all 3. So you can see there was even for guys like Griffin and Lake who had previously voted against suffrage earlier, they had aligned with the Republican Party at this point and were voting for it in 1919. And so then we finish up with, it took, as I said, a little over a year to get to 36 states. Tennessee became the 36th state on the 18th of August, 1920, to ratify the 19th Amendment. And here we have a picture of Tennessee Governor Albert Roberts signing it. Interesting that Tennessee, a southern state, approved it. It was one of the few southern states that did approve the 19th Amendment either during the ratification process or immediately thereafter. Only I think Texas and Tennessee are really the 2 that stand out to me that did it during the process. Actually, most of the states of the former Confederacy took many decades before they ratified the 19th Amendment. In fact, the last one to do so was Mississippi, which I believe ratified it in 1984. So you could see that it went on, and in most of the 11 states of the former Confederacy during the Civil War, waited until after World War II to ratify. There was quite a bit of resistance in the South. And you can see that explains to me why Wilson, kind of hedged his bets on supporting women's suffrage, because as a Democrat, the Democrats in those days controlled the Southern politics, and he would have had a hard time overcoming the resistance of Southern Democrats in the process. So the 19th Amendment formally became law on the 26th of August, 1920, and we have a copy of the document that signed by U.S. Secretary of the State Bainbridge Colby, that putting it into effect. And so at that point, women, even in states that hadn't adjusted their state laws to allow women's suffrage, which Iowa was one of them, the 19th Amendment overruled them and enfranchised women from that point on.